أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone in a partnership. There never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers and sisters, friends and family, everybody tuning into the live stream. This will be a recording for this upcoming week because of the upcoming celebration of the Eid al-Adha, which is on the 16th of June of 2024. So if I may make a quick dua, alhamdulillah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our ibadah, our worship. May He increase us and accept us as amongst the righteous doers and the forerunners on the day of judgment, and bring us to the Jannah without account or with an easy account. Ameen. May you find time with your family, or for those who may not have established that yet, find good time with your community, friends, and those who are closest to you, or even for those who may still have that difficulty that we sometimes do experience as reverts. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for you to find something that you find enjoyable on this day in celebration, inshallah. But glad to know that for those who are watching now, alhamdulillah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also bless you for keeping the rhythm or finding some time for the reflection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's Prophet sallallahu during this time, or after this time of the holiday, alhamdulillah. But we're going to be continuing on with the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu of When the Moon Split, compiled by Safiur, Rahman, Mubarakpuri, When the Moon Split. So we had left off last time around page 67, after the polytheists avoid openly abusing the Prophet. So we will continue on page 67. Bismillah. The talks between Abu Talib and the Quraysh. So after considerable thought as to strategy, some nobles of the Quraysh came to Abu Talib and said to him, "Your nephew speaks ill of our gods, casts blame on our religion, calls us ignorant and frivolous, and denounces our fathers as depraved and misguided. Either you stop him or cut him off so that we can deal with him." So Abu Talib answered them mildly and let them leave without an altercation. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, however, continued to proclaim himself Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's prophet and continued to call on all to embrace Islam. So the Quraysh then challenged Abu Talib. Soon the Quraysh realized that Abu Talib was not going to ask his nephew to stop his rebellious preaching. They could no longer keep silent, and eventually they all came together to plan their response to the situation. Afterwards, they again met with Abu Talib, and this time their words were not so honeyed. They warned him sternly, "O Abu Talib, you are old and we hold you in high esteem. We asked you to restrain your nephew, but you did nothing. By God, we cannot tolerate this any longer. Our fathers are denounced. We are called ignorant and our gods are insulted. Either you stop him or we will fight you both until one side perishes." So Abu Talib felt the sting of these belligerent words. The polytheists of Mecca had challenged him, and he took the threat seriously. So he sent for the Prophet ﷺ and told him of what the men of the Quraysh had said. "Have mercy on me and yourself," he told his nephew, "and do not impose on me a burden greater than I can bear." And when the Prophet ﷺ heard what Abu Talib had to say, he replied with the following: "O my uncle, I swear by Allah, if they were to place the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left and ask me to abandon this mission, I would not turn from it until Allah made me victorious or I perish therein." And witnessing the Prophet ﷺ, Muhammad's resolve, Abu Talib unhesitatingly offered his nephew his full support. "Come back, my nephew. Go where you please and say what you will. By God, I will never turn away from you, come what may." So the Quraysh then make Abu Talib a strange proposal. The Quraysh saw that their threats and challenges had been ignored. Muhammad SAW was still preaching the doctrine that defamed their gods and the customs of their ancestors. They also found that Abu Talib was not about to abandon his nephew in the face of threats. Instead, he seemed to be prepared to fight the entire tribe in order to protect him. So the Quraysh considered the immense potential danger of the situation. Muhammad SAW was popular among the people of Mecca, although he represented a threat to their way of life. He held more meetings to try to come up with ways to deal with them, and alas, they decided to make Abu Talib a proposal. The idea revolved around Amara bin Walid, a handsome young boy from the Quraysh tribe. They took him to Abu Talib and said, "O Abu Talib, take this youth from us and treat him as your own son. Give him your complete support. In exchange for him, give us your nephew, a young man who has challenged the way of your forefathers and caused disputes among the Meccans, denouncing them as ignorant men who have deviated from the straight path. We shall then put him to death. After all, we are giving you one man in exchange for another." So Abu Talib could only respond to such a ridiculous idea with sarcasm. "By God, you are offering me a very bad bargain. You are giving me your son so that I can feed him lavishly and asking for my son so that you may kill him. By God, it will never happen." So the persecution of the Prophet ﷺ continues. When neither threats nor bargains proved successful in swaying Abu Talib, the Quraysh decided to persecute the Prophet ﷺ. Simultaneously, they intensified their campaign against the believers. And because of the Prophet ﷺ's high position in Meccan society, only those of like standing dared to mistreat him. Those who harassed the Prophet ﷺ in his own house were Abu Lahab, Hakam bin Abi al-As bin Umayyah, Uqba bin Abi Muayyat, Hidayy bin Hamra Thaqafi, Ibn al-Asta Hadab, all of whom were his neighbors. And when the Prophet ﷺ bowed down in prayer, some threw the fetus of a camel on his back. Others would throw similar filth at his door. And the Prophet ﷺ would remove it with a piece of wood and say, "O Banu Abu Munaf, what kind of neighborhood is this?" And whenever Umayyah bin Khawf saw the Prophet ﷺ, he would taunt him before the people of Mecca. Similarly, his brother Abi bin Khalaf crumbled a rotten bone and threw it in the face of the Prophet ﷺ. He would also say to the Prophet ﷺ, "O Muhammad, I have a horse named Ud, and I feed it 3 heaps of food so that I can kill you while upon its back." And one day the Prophet ﷺ answered his challenge by saying, "No, it is I who will kill you." And the Prophet ﷺ's words came true when he killed Abi during the Battle of Uhud. And on another occasion, Uqba bin Abi Muayyad sat beside the Prophet ﷺ listening to him. And when Abi bin Khalaf found out his friends Uqba had been with the Prophet ﷺ, he chided him for that and then said to Uqba, "Go and spit in the face of Muhammad." And ever mindful that the allegiance to the tribe came before even honor and decency, Uqba rose from his seat, approached the Prophet ﷺ, and spat in his face. And Abu Lahab, the Prophet's uncle, who had freed a slave to celebrate his nephew's birth, became his sworn enemy from the day he heard his nephew call the people to Islam from atop Mount Safa. And the 2 sons of Abu Lahab, Utbah and Atiba, had married the Prophet ﷺ's daughters, Ruqayya and Kulthum, respectively, and Abu Lahab ordered both his sons to divorce their wives, threatening never to see them again if they refused. And his wife, Jamil Ardi bin Harb, also asked them to divorce their wives, for they had become disbelievers. And Utbah and Atiba obeyed their parents and divorced the Prophet ﷺ's daughters. And Jamil was no less vicious in her enmity. Her nephew by marriage was posturing as a messenger, daring to oppose the gods she held dear. She resolved to punish him. She used to scatter prickly bits of wood over the path of the Prophet ﷺ, and his companions would pass. And when Jamil heard that a short chapter of the Quran, Surah Abu Lahab, had been revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, which condemned her to hell for this very act, she began searching for him, armed with a rock. And he was sitting near the Kaaba along with Abu Bakr, radiallahu anhu, and she strode up to Abu Bakr and asked him, "Where is your companion gone? I have gone. I have come to know that he speaks ill of me, and by God, if I find him, I shall hurl the stone at his face. Look, I am also a poet." She then uttered the following verses and went away. We disobeyed the blameworthy, rejected his call, and renounced his religion with disdain. And Abu Bakr was amazed that Jamil had not seen the Prophet ﷺ sitting right beside him. "O Prophet, did she fail to see you?" And he ﷺ had responded, "Yes, she could not see me because Allah SWT sees her sight." And meanwhile, the Quraysh invented a new way of abusing the Prophet ﷺ. They began calling him Mutammim instead of Muhammad, the meaning of which is the opposite of the real name. Muhammad is one who is highly praised, while Mutammim is one that is vehemently condemned. And Allah SWT, however, protected the Prophet ﷺ's honor by revealing that the Quraysh abused one known as Mutammim, while the Prophet was Muhammad by name. And as has been mentioned earlier, one of the most adamant enemies of the Prophet ﷺ and his followers was Abu Jahl. His actual name was Abu Hakam, which literally means father of wisdom. Abu Hakam, which means father of wisdom, but his behavior towards the Prophet ﷺ and the early Muslims earned him the title Abu Jahl, father of ignorance. And anyone who abandoned the local pagan religion for Islam was a renegade, and Abu Jahl would take him to task for his treachery. He abused the Prophet ﷺ openly and would attempt to obstruct the Prophet ﷺ from performing his prayers. And one day Abu Jahl saw the Prophet ﷺ performing his prayers and began harassing and threatening him as he prayed. At last, the Prophet ﷺ caught hold of a piece of cloth around Abu Jahl's neck and shaking him strongly, quoted these two verses from the Quran. Allah SWT mentions Surah 75, ayat 34 and 35. "Woe to you, woe to you, again, woe to you, woe to you." And Abu Jahl shot back, "Muhammad, you are challenging me. By God, you and your Lord cannot do me any harm. I am the strongest man in the valley." And eager for revenge, Abu Jahl asked his comrades, "Does Muhammad put his face on the earth in your presence?" "Yes," they replied. By Lat and Uzza, Abu Jahl swore, "If I ever see him do so, I shall trample his face and neck into the dust." And the day came when Abu Jahl saw the Prophet ﷺ performing his prayer, so he marched towards him with the intention of carrying out his threat. And suddenly onlookers saw him retreat before reaching the defenseless Muhammad ﷺ, his arms clawing at the air. And what happened, Abu Hakam, the people asked. "A trench of fire and a screen of devastation stood between him and me," the dazed Abu Jahl replied. And the Prophet ﷺ remarked to his followers, "Had he come near to me, the angels would have swooped down upon every limb of his." And Uqba bin Abi Muayyad was also another who earned eternal disgrace for his despicable treatment of the Prophet ﷺ. And once the Prophet ﷺ was praying near the Kaaba, while Abu Jahl and his comrades were sitting nearby. Meanwhile, Abu Jahl asked the others, "Is there one who will bring the innards of a camel of Banu so-and-so and place it on Muhammad's back while he was prostrating in prayer?" And Uqba, anxious to prove his daring, got up and returned with the intestines of a slaughtered camel. He stayed to the side until he saw the opportunity to catch the Prophet ﷺ in prostration, while the Prophet ﷺ bowed his head to the earth. Uqba laid the camel's intestines on the Prophet's neck and shoulders. And Abu Jahl and his followers burst into laughter, so the Prophet ﷺ remained in prostration and did not raise his head. Someone informed the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, who then came running to the Kaaba. She removed the foul-smelling intestines from her father's back, and he raised his head and prayed to Allah, "O Allah, seize the Quraysh." And when Abu Jahl and his comrades heard Muhammad's prayer, they felt a very heavy weight on their hearts because they believed that in Mecca, all prayers were granted. And the Prophet ﷺ continued to pray loud in front of his enemies, mentioning each one by name and asking Allah to avenge him. The Quraysh were right about their misgivings regarding the Prophet ﷺ's prayer for retribution, for Allah SWT soon answered it. In the Battle of Badr, which was the first battle the Muslims fought against the pagan Meccans, each person the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the prayer fell on that battlefield. And it seemed as if the enemies of Islam far outnumbered the followers of the Prophet ﷺ. All of the notables, with the exception of the discerning fortunate few like Abu Bakr and Uthman, anhum, used their wealth and power to persecute the Prophet ﷺ. And besides Abu Jahl, the 5 prominent persons who used to ridicule the Prophet were Walid bin Mughira Makhzumi, Aswad bin Abi Yuhuth Zuri, Abu Zama, Aswad bin Abdul Muttalib Asadi, Harith bin Gayas Huzay, and As bin Wa'il Sahmi. And the Prophet ﷺ did not take revenge even once during the many years he lived in Mecca. After he began his mission, he was content with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promise that he himself would deal with his opponents and detractors. And in the end, Muhammad ﷺ's harshest enemies met with agonizing deaths. And Walid bin Mughira was merely scratched by an arrow, and he thought nothing of it. The angel Jibril, however, pointed towards the scratch, and it became inflamed. The wound plagued Walid for many years until he finally died. And likewise, Jibril pointed towards the head of Aswad bin Abd Yuhuth, and he developed boils that caused his death. Another source stated that these boils resulted from sunstroke that Jibril had inflicted on him. And according to another narration, Jibril pointed toward Aswad's belly, and he developed dropsy that caused his belly to swell so much that he died. And when Aswad bin Abdul Muttalib became excessive in his persecution of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to snatch his eyesight and to deprive him of fatherhood. And in response to this supplication, Jibril was sent to strike his face with a thorny branch so that Aswad lost his eyesight. He then struck his son dead. And Harith bin Qais, the last of these 5 previously named opponents of the Prophet ﷺ, met a horrible death as he lay dying, his stomach filled with yellow fluid, and the contents of his intestines began to flow from his nose. So divine intervention and retribution came to those most active and vocal in their hatred of Islam, but for the most part, the Prophet ﷺ quietly endured all of the hardship, just as the prophets before him had done. And looking at his patience and unshakable faith, the believers were heartened during their suffering in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Verbal abuse and physical threats continued, so the Prophet ﷺ devised ways of defense. He took 2 steps to help securing the fledgling Muslims. The first was Dar al-Arqam. First, the Prophet ﷺ began using the house of Arqam bin Abi Arqam as a secret center for prayer, preaching, education, and training. And Arqam's house was ideally located at the foot of Mount Safa, only a short walk from the Kaaba and its bustling crowds. And the pagans who lived in the area, therefore, did not take notice of the many people who gathered at Arqam's house. The Prophet ﷺ would meet his companions there and recite verses of the Quran to them, which they would then memorize, and these arrangements allowed the early Muslims to learn the essential tenets of Islam and perform prayers in secret without incurring the wrath of their neighbors or other family members who had not converted. And as for the Prophet ﷺ, he continued to perform his prayers in the open for all to see. In the face of persecution, of insults, and of harassment, he kept preaching the message of Islam to everyone that he met. It was the wisdom and mercy of Allah that the Prophet ﷺ never refrained from carrying on with his mission, even under extremely adverse conditions. And because of his efforts, no soul will be able to argue on the day of judgment that Allah did not send a messenger to warn those who were astray and to show them the straight path. And with that, before we continue further, especially since it'll be a recording for this this week here, we'll stop here and we will continue on page 75 of the following week. Again, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you, and thank you for joining me for the reading for today. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make things easier for you and accept your sacrifice if you have sacrificed today, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put blessings in your Eid. Ameen. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdi ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.